you were born in 1980 and you moved to the UK in 1996. So you were 16 or 17?
Yeah.
Okay.
16.
16. And you said your studies were going well in Nigeria. What were you interested in, and what did you study? Now, you have a background in engineering and law, which are very disparate fields. So I'm very curious about that. But so what were you oriented to academically when you were 16? And did you have political aspirations or ambitions that early?
No. How would I have political aspirations? I grew up under a military government. I didn't even know what politics was. You kind of knew what democracy was, but you knew you didn't have it. So the politics and the political sort of interest came much, much later. I was supposed to be a doctor like my parents and my uncles and aunts and all their friends. That was the family that I was born, that was the sort of family that I was born into. And I had, when I talked about that part scholarship, I had a pre-med part scholarship to Stanford, and my father couldn't afford the rest of it. And that was age 16. So there was time, and I came here, and the first thing I did was get a job because I was left on my own and I wanted money. So I got a job at McDonald's, and I went to a college part-time for sort of 16 to 18-year-olds. It's called a further education college. And I just thought, well, my parents are doctors. Of course, I will be a doctor as well. And what I didn't realize was that between the expectations of the school I was going to and the amount of time I was spending earning money and flipping burgers and eating them, that actually I was no longer on that academic track. And I also had my first experience of what I call the poverty of the soft bigotry of low expectations. Because I had grown up in a relatively wealthy middle-class family. Everybody's a doctor. And of course you get all A's, and of course you do well. It just wasn't even a thing to not succeed academically. And I got to a school where failing was okay, and it didn't matter if you didn't get the top grades. And the teachers would say, well, why do you want to be a doctor? You can be a nurse instead. And it wasn't because they wanted to keep me down. It was because what they had seen was that if you're Black, then you probably shouldn't be stretched too much because you won't achieve it. And so they set lower targets and give you a huge congratulations and a round of applause for meeting them. That was the complete opposite of my upbringing. And
well, Nigerians do particularly well when they immigrate, let's say, to the United States. And so there doesn't seem to be a culture of low expectation that's pervasive in Nigeria. I mean, I don't know how to account for the differential success of Nigerians. Maybe you can shed some light on that, or maybe you just did. And I'm also curious about your statement that your family was relatively wealthy in Nigeria, because you might want to clarify that too, because there's a difference between relatively wealthy and wealthy. And so a little bit more about, like, you were obviously upper middle class, let's say, in terms of educational background, your family and aspiration, but economically, from what I understand, it was still relatively tough going at times in Nigeria.
Being relatively wealthy in a poor country is very different from being relatively wealthy in the West. For me, being relatively wealthy meant that we had a car, and we, certainly up until I was about 13, we had running water. After 13, we stopped having running water. And we could occasionally, but not very frequently, travel on holiday. But we didn't have electricity a lot of the time. So it's an experience that comes from just being in a poor country, that even when you have a bit of money, you still experience life like people who don't have any. So no electricity, eventually no running water, lots of fuel shortages, but I was never hungry. So that's what I mean by that. And you're absolutely right. A lot of Nigerians who do leave the country end up doing well because they have left a system that holds them back and go to a system that allows them to flourish. And that's why I'm so interested in what is it that holds people back in one place and allows them to flourish in another. And it is not just money. It is many of the things that go with culture, the attitude to entrepreneurship, whether you live in a high trust or a low trust society. It's a very low trust society. You get a lot of clan behavior, but it's a very competitive place. So if you grow up in a very competitive culture and you then live in a place where competition is allowed and is allowed to flourish, you will very likely do well. And I think that's one of the things that explains the factors when people look at the demographics.
Say that last part again. I want to just make sure I followed your argumentation there about the competitiveness.
I think, yes. So I think that if you live in a place, if you've come from a country that is very competitive because there are limited resources, because there are not enough jobs to go around, there are not enough university places, so you need to be very academic, you need to be, very hustling in your behavior. And then you move to a place where you don't have those barriers, but you still have that culture, you are more likely to succeed. And I think that is what explains some of the success of, I think it's West Africans, not just Nigerians.
Right.
As I suspect, as you see more and more lower skilled migration, I think you will start to see those improvements disappearing as well. I think that's one of the things. I remember seeing a study that mentioned that. So, the relative class of the people who move makes a difference. And it's one of the reasons why I say it's not just about the country people come from, but who is coming, what skills are they bringing, and do they want the place to succeed?
Right. Well, and that's not even precisely class in the Marxist economic sense. It's more like level of intrinsic aspiration. And there'd be the determinants of that are actually relatively difficult to specify. What makes someone see. The funny thing about you, so to speak, and this is how I felt when I lived in Montreal, because I didn't have a lot of money as a graduate student, and I lived among relatively poor people by Montreal standards, which, they were still doing fine. I wasn't poor because my level of aspiration and possibility, right? And the idea that poverty is a consequence merely of lack of money is an unbelievably foolish presumption. And your upper middle class status, as you already pointed out, wasn't a consequence of absolute wealth, although relatively you were doing okay. It was a consequence of the fact that your family was so educated and so aspirational that it was an unspoken reality that you could and would succeed, right? That's wealth, to have that.
Yes, it is more important than just pure money, because it means that you can be thrown into any sort of circumstance and you are likely to succeed. And I always consider myself so lucky, because had I been born into a different family, I might have had a different trajectory. And it's one of the reasons why I think that family is something that is not talked about enough in UK politics. And maybe we talk about a little bit more childcare for mothers and certain policy elements, but family is the biggest determinant of your success and your life outcomes. And we need to make sure that we have more stable families.
Yeah, well, we know, for example, the literature on fatherlessness, for example, is that there's almost nothing that puts a child at higher risk for poor long-term life outcome than fatherlessness, for example. And so
I think we have a statistic here that 95% of the prison population, or certainly in the 90s, the 90% plus of the prison population, the male prison population, grew up without their father.
Yeah, so there's effects of fatherlessness that are not only behavioral in the way that you just described, so more dysregulated aggression among men, but even more fundamental physiological alterations. So boys who are fatherless have shorter telomeres by the age of 12, which means that their life expectancy is shorter. And girls,
really?
Yes, absolutely. 12 to 15% shorter. It's remarkable. And girls who lack a father hit puberty 1 year earlier, right? That's a major change. And so that just shows you how what would you say, pronounced and fundamental that disintegration of family below the nuclear level actually is. And that's certainly not merely an economic problem, although it's also an economic problem.